Thank you, Tim. Now you've got me still. The tech people want to wait till the break before they get Lisa back. So I'm now channeling Lisa Miller, although I'm really glad I don't have her job, which involves getting up about 3 o'clock in the morning. So I'm going to kick off with one of my Lisa Miller questions to actually ask you both. How have you dealt with the growing mistrust of the media?
Tim, why don't you go first?
I know it's a big question.
My first rule is don't read the comments. My second rule is don't read the comments. I see it primarily online. I unfortunately am not in a place where I walk downtown and my sources are there. I'm working in a national context in a small town. But I'm not getting that feedback the way I did when I was on a weekly and saw the mayor in church or went to school with his kids or something like that, or her kids. So I don't confront that distrust immediately. And in person, I think from a content standpoint, we try to be straightforward about, if somebody is representing a certain viewpoint, we try to make it clear what that is. If there are affiliations, if there are any kinds of connections that might cause somebody to think, oh, they got a dog in this fight. We try to be very transparent about that. And, I would have said in the past, well, you can't argue with data. But I've seen people argue with data, so I think it's a very difficult question.
My answer is that you do the very best job you can always. You always are fair, thorough, and accurate, tell the truth. Stay on your side of the street, don't editorialize, don't endorse, don't offer an opinion about things, report what happens. Don't give anybody something to distrust is probably the easiest way to get them to trust you. And also be humble. Journalists and journalism tend to be very arrogant when mistakes are made. The reality is we all make mistakes. We're all human. And I think the problem for journalists is not so much making mistakes, but failing to take responsibility for mistakes when we make them, not acknowledging the mistake, not correcting the mistake as visibly as we made it. We are no different than anybody else in terms of our ability to get tripped up in our best intentions. We're all flawed like everybody else. And if you don't own your mistakes, if you don't demonstrate transparently the process that you go through to do your journalism, then you give people reason to doubt your sincerity when you say, as we all say, that we want to do the very best job we can and give them something that they can count on. We wear the uniform of no team but Texas. That's what we say all the time. We're nonpartisan in our journalistic orientation, which means that we don't choose sides. We listen, as Tim referred to, we listen to everybody, give everybody a fair hearing. But I will also make the observation that nonpartisan is not non-thinking. When bullshit needs to be called, we call bullshit. If somebody lies, you call them out for it. If somebody presents a conspiracy theory masquerading as facts, you call them out for it. But the obligation that we all have as journalists is to give people the thing that they're after, which is reliable, credible information. Give them nothing to distrust, and they will have no reason to distrust you.
Thank you. There's some extremely good advice there. I think I'll be reading back on the answers to those questions from you both. Thank you. Another question. Philanthropy is quite significant in the US, but it's not in Australia. How do you convince people to hand over money to support journalistic endeavors?
Tim, I'll jump in on that one if that's okay. I've spent most of the last 13 years separating people from their money in support of serious journalism. This is not something I came to the table with thinking was a skill of mine, but it becomes a necessity and therefore a skill when the job you have is to raise money to pay for this kind of work. And as I said in my remarks, we every day persuade people and institutions who don't think at the start of that day, I'm going to spend my money on media, to spend money on media, to give money in support of this work, convincing them that it's both in their interest and in the public interest to do so. And one of the best bits of advice I got early on was talk to people about this, not in terms of journalism or media, but in terms of Texas and democracy. This is really about the state of Texas being as great a place to live and work, to do business as it possibly can be. An informed Texas is a better Texas. Smarter Texans, better informed Texans, more engaged Texans are better Texans. And so you persuade people that the state they love, whatever else we don't agree on, we all agree on the fact that we love the state of Texas. We want it to be as good as it can be. The way you persuade people to spend money with you is making it about making Texas better by making Texans better informed and more engaged. And again, back in 09 and 10 and 11, we talked about the need for informed communities as an essential element of a properly functioning democracy. Now, as Tim can tell you, the conversation about democracy in 2010, 2011, very different from the conversation about democracy now. Democracy was theoretically at peril then. It is actually at peril now. And so never more important than now to talk about the importance of this kind of journalism as an element of a properly functioning democracy.
Sure. Tim, do you have something to add?
Well, we started, and the Tribune started in many ways before the surge in journalism funding from foundations. And so our earliest money, it was only later that we kind of got through the Institute for Nonprofit News, which Sue Cross is another of your panelists later. That was very helpful in kind of establishing our credibility. People didn't know what to make of us. We were nonprofit news at a time when there was no such thing in a way. But early money came around topics more than around journalism. And so it wasn't just, as Evan was talking about, it wasn't just about better informing, but it was about, here's an issue we're going to look at, and it's part of this larger initiative, and we're going to provide this information in a way that moves the ball on how the public understands and works on this and how policies are made. And that was helpful to be able to approach it from that standpoint, as opposed to journalism is good, you should be giving us money, and which is a hard sell.
So indeed. Thank you. Now we have our first question from the audience. Audience, you are journalists, so I'd expect you'll be sending some more questions, please. Here's the first question. Hi, I'm a researcher on safety for journalists. Do you have particular safety protocol? And where do you go for safety training or information for your journos? E.g., do you mainly use online courses?
I think this is going to be more relevant to Evan. So,
well, I can tell you that certainly we are focused on our people, the people who produce our journalism. This is an office where we look out for and take care of one another, which all good businesses should be. And we have absolutely seen our journalists, like so many other journalists around the country, subject to harassment online, targeted by people who I can only describe as bad actors. Actually, I'd probably describe them off camera in more colorful language. We are enrolled in a number of different efforts to engage in a number of different efforts, including enrolled in coursework to provide the very best guidance for our journalists on how to protect themselves online. We have policies at the Tribune related to online harassment of our journalists and how we stand by them and support them. I wish the world were not constructed this way. Accessibility is a two-way street. By making ourselves and our journalists available online to everybody, the result is that anybody has the ability to get at them and to get to them. And so we want to be sure that we're careful in protecting them. But you know what? There is no way that any of us at the Tribune is going to be dissuaded from doing our important work. And it's important to say that we never let the bad guys win as it relates to this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, there's another question here. I think this one also goes towards Evan, but I'm sure that it might be something that Tim wants to talk about too. Evan, you said you had no competitors, but collaborators.
Right.
The questioner would like to know, is that negotiated story by story, or do you work by establishing good relationships with a core group of other editors?
Well, it's certainly the latter as a high level strategy. You know, we come in peace. We are not in a position to replace the legacy news organizations in our state, don't seek to replace them and could not replace them. Even in a reduced staff size and state, those papers are still doing the very best that they can. And we do not root for their failure or their demise. We root for them when they do great work. We amplify their best work. No one cheers louder when the Dallas Morning News or the Houston Chronicle, the Austin American Statesman does good work than we cheer. We recognize, though, that they can't accomplish as much as they wish they could, as they may have accomplished in the past. These are fast-growing cities, fast-growing counties, and yet the footprint of these news organizations is shrinking. So we have said from the very beginning, we want to work with you, alongside you, promote your work. Our reporters and your reporters do things together that they could not accomplish separately. We're big believers in 1 + 1 = more than 2, right, institutionally. And then on specific projects, we will certainly, on a one-off basis, to the questioner's point, go and negotiate, you know, what can we do together on this? Look, because of our free syndication model, we find ourselves in conversation with the leaders of these papers all over the state on a regular basis. And so the opportunity to work closely with them as partners exists. Again, I want to say the mission that we all have is to get the word out about things important enough for people in Texas to know. If that mission is accomplished through our door or somebody else's door, it's all good.
Thank you. Now, Tim, let's send this one in your direction first. Local stories generally don't resonate outside a local area. How do you cover local areas that are small, such as rural area stories, in a way that is relevant and worthwhile for a wide readership, say at state level?
That is a challenge. There's no way around it. The interesting thing about these weeklies I'm talking about and the very local places, you know, if it happens one county over, which is, you know, a small, it's bigger than a town, but it's not news if it happens in Fayette County as opposed to Madison County, even though it might be 3 miles. And there is, I think, in a lot of the regional journalism, localism is a big news value. So I think data can be very helpful in this case, that it is possible to do multiple leads on stories based on data that you get from a locality. And there are patterns and trends that can be reported on, and you can point out, here's what your community is doing, here's what this larger group of communities is doing, here's what's happening nationally, and help people sort of see where they fit in that mixture. So it is possible to not automate, but to streamline some of the content so that it can jump the county line, if you will.
I would just jump in and say that we're in an unusual situation in the state of Texas compared to, I suspect, Tim, a lot of other places. When before I started the Tribune, I was the longtime editor-in-chief of Texas Monthly magazine, which is a pretty successful regional magazine that's now approaching 50 years in business. And the publisher and founder of that magazine, Mike Levy, once said to me, Texas is more like a city than a state. Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Houston are neighborhoods. People in Texas identify as Texans first and as Austinites, Dallasites, Houstonians second. There is an intimacy to the way people think about the entirety of Texas that makes it so that if we report a story that happens in Lubbock, for instance, or in Amarillo, people in Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, Fort Worth inherently care, because that's the nature of this state. It makes it a lot easier to do statewide media in a place where everybody cares about everything. I have to say, I would not envy that challenge for someone running, say, a California publication. California is actually like 3 states. Texas is like a city. And so we benefit from that intimacy.
Yes, I feel sure that with our state-based system, we can see that we're perhaps not as united as the Texans, the Lone Star State, isn't it? So, okay, now the point about journalists being defensive about owning their mistakes has clearly struck a chord with our audience. One journalist says, you talked about calling out bullshit, but what if the bullshit's coming from a rival news organization? What would you both do?
Tim?
How dare you question me about that? No, you know, part of the, I don't know in that case, if it is bullshit, it's bullshit. It doesn't matter who's saying it. I think the idea of false equivalencies, that if you quote a sane person, you have to quote an insane person, is that's not a way to share information. So if it is a rival outlet, the press traditionally in the US has been very reluctant to talk about itself and to talk about how it gets stories and to be transparent about those sorts of things. And so we've been careful about commenting on other outlets as well. I think that's changing for the better. People expect more of that kind of metadata, if you will. And so commenting on other outlets and you can, if it is bad intentioned, that's one thing. If it's a mistake, I think we should be able to have a conversation about what the underlying truth is, as opposed, and not have to come to blows rhetorically about that.
I'll echo what Tim said. You know, the source of criticism is less important than the substance of the criticism and the validity of the criticism. I don't care if another media organization criticizes the Tribune over something. If we did something wrong and worth criticizing, we have to own it, regardless of whether the person criticizing us is another media organization. I will say that one of the things that disappoints me in this country at the moment is that we do not really have significant numbers of serious media critics. I would call out my old college mate. We were a year apart at college together, Eric Wemple, who is the media columnist for the Washington Post, who is extremely good at identifying areas in which his colleagues in the media don't always hold up their end, and he's unafraid of calling them out. We need to be subject to the same level of scrutiny that we subject other people to. If it's good enough for us to ask things of people and to scrutinize them, we should be comfortable being scrutinized and having things asked of us ourselves.
Thank you. Now, here's a question from Johan Lidberg of Monash University. Johan says, I'm part of a team researching the News Media Bargaining Code, Australia's attempt to get Google and Facebook to pay for news content. I know this is being considered in the US as well. Any movement re this in the US? Is it being discussed how this would benefit regional and local journalism? And to the moderators today, will the NBC situation in Australia be discussed today? And I think surely, but let's hear from our guests first.
You know, we receive support, grant support from both Facebook and Google as part of our funding from time to time. What I like the big tech companies that through the way they manipulate search and the way that they operate, and to the degree that the way they do those things, that negatively impacts audience from a journalism standpoint, would I like them to spend money with all of us? Hell yes, I would like them to spend money with all of us. Who would not? Is there a plan for that to happen in some kind of formal or official capacity? Well, there are a lot of discussions about the ways in which economic relief can be brought to the table for journalism. But no, I'm not aware of any formal plan, either in discussion or especially in place.
Okay, and well, just one more question before we go to the break. Again, this kicks off with Texas, but I think it's probably a general question as well. In Texas, how do you balance the need for public interest journalism on climate change with the home of big oil, being the home of big oil, and the growing understanding of fossil fuels' influence on journalism?
you do it by telling the truth. You do it by reporting the facts. You don't allow the fact that this is the home of anything to in any way impact the journalism that you provide. Look, I don't care who's here as an industry in the state of Texas, and I don't care who has influence financially over us or over anybody else. Our job, as I said, is to search for the truth and tell people what we find without regard to money or anything else. I can always get more money. I can never get more integrity as a journalist. And so I don't think twice about the fact that the oil and gas industry is in the state of Texas. We report on climate change. Hell yes. We report fearlessly, faithfully, and persistently, period. Nothing else to say on that. Tim, do you have a version of that conversation where you are?
Well, I would just say one question I got early on and still get is how do you deal with the expectations of donors or the influence of donors on stories? And there is a firewall, but I've worked in traditional commercial journalism and I've worked in nonprofit journalism, and any day of the week I would take the pressures I get at the desk I'm at now over the ones I got at the newspaper about what we were going to cover and how we were going to cover it. They were selling ads, they were doing circulation. So it's
the idea that there are not financial influences on for-profit media is crackers. Of course there are those pressures. It's no different.
And at least in the nonprofit world, and especially for organizations like ours and the Tribune, that there is a firewall and a code of conduct about how that money is used and what's promised and left unsaid.
And transparency. We disclose every single dollar donated to the Texas Tribune in real time. You can go back 13 years, see every single dollar of that $100 million donated, who gave it. And we have disclosures on any story in which a donor is mentioned. And if I go to a for-profit news organization, I hardly see that level of transparency. I'm not complaining or criticizing. But to my mind, actually, Tim's organization, our organization, and others are probably more visibly transparent than the traditional press as far as that goes. So I sleep at night. I'm sure Tim does too.
Thank you. Look, there's some very, very inspiring and provocative points that you've just made in the discussion. Thank you for being with us. We need to sadly slope off because I know there would be more and more questions. We could talk for hours on this topic, but I think we've all learned a lot. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to take a short break and we'll be back at 10:35 Australian Eastern Summer Time, the Sydney time. So I hope you can work around that, folk in other states. So our next panel will be how we sustain regional journalism. Thank you so much.